The Tonight Show stage was a terrifying place. For 30 years, it was the mountaintop of American entertainment, and Johnny Carson was its stern, witty gatekeeper. He was notoriously hard to please. When a guest bombed, Carson had a cold stare that could freeze the feed. When they bored him, he would shuffle papers or spin his wedding ring, a silent, devastating tell. But when he liked you, the gates of heaven opened. He would lean back, slap the desk, and let that boyish grin crack through the cool exterior. If he liked you, America liked you, recalled gossip columnist Rona Barrett. Over 22,000 guests sat on that famous couch. Most were forgettable. Some were disasters. But a select few were royalty. Based on exclusive archival data and the remembrances of producers like Peter Lost Sally, here are the 10 guests who made the king of late night genuinely happy. We start with a paradox. By the numbers, Bob Hope was everywhere. He appeared constantly. Yet, most of Carson's inner circle knows that Johnny tolerated Hope rather than loved him. However, Johnny respected the throne. Bob Hope was the bridge between the old Hollywood vaudeville era and the modern television age. Carson admired Hope's work ethic but found the man impossible to talk to. According to Hope's biographer Richard Zoglin, Carson resented that Hope used the show as a promotional jukebox, rolling in prepackaged clips and deaf to improvisation. There was nothing spontaneous about Hope, said writer Andrew Nichols. Johnny appreciated people who felt engaged with the real world. There was nothing to talk to Bob about. So why is he on a love list? Because Johnny loved the idea of him. He represented the relentless, joke-an-hour machine that Carson aspired to be. Despite the friction, Carson paid tribute to Hope on his 90th birthday, breaking his retirement to do a monologue. You don't do that for people you hate. May 6, 1981. A young, nervous Jerry Seinfeld walked onto the stage. He had bombed a set on the same stage just a few years earlier under another host, but this was the big leagues. Seinfeld did a tight 5 minutes about the insanity of daily life. The puffy shirt hadn't been invented yet, but the blueprint was there. Carson loved him immediately. He loved the precision. Unlike the manic characters of the era, Seinfeld was an observer. Carson saw a younger version of himself, handsome, suit-clad, and slightly removed from the chaos. Seinfeld became a frequent guest, and crucially, Carson gave him the point. After his sets, Johnny would often just nod. But with Jerry, he'd bring him back to the couch and ask, "How do you write that?" That question was the holy grail for a comedian. That was the moment, Seinfeld later reflected. When Johnny asked you how you did it, you knew you were in. Rodney Dangerfield got no respect, except from Johnny Carson. Rodney's appearances were masterclasses in controlled anxiety. He would come out, tug at his white shirt collar, and immediately launch into a diatribe about his wife, his dog, or his psychiatrist. What Johnny loved about Rodney was the authenticity of the pain. Carson, who hid his emotions behind a curtain of booze and privacy, was fascinated by a man who put his insecurities on display for a laugh. They also shared a history of Vegas grind work. When Rodney ad-libbed, "I tell ya, I went to a fight the other night and a hockey game broke out," Carson didn't just laugh, he marveled at the construction of the line. Rodney was one of the few guests who could sit on the couch and essentially do his act with Johnny acting as the straight man, a role Carson relished because it was so easy. The relationship between Johnny Carson and David Letterman is the most complicated and tender of the late-night era. Letterman was the hip, sarcastic Indiana kid who grew up idolizing Johnny. When Dave first appeared on November 24, 1978, he wore a corny suit and did a bit about a Velcro suit. It was weird. Carson loved weird. Johnny saw in Letterman the future, the irony, the deconstruction of the medium. He promoted him heavily, even having him guest host frequently. However, the love story fractured during The Tonight Show succession battle. When Johnny chose Jay Leno over Dave, it broke Dave's heart. Yet, the love never died. In one of the most emotional moments in television history, Johnny invited Letterman to be the sole guest on his second-to-last show. They talked about magic and respect. "You are the best," Johnny told him, giving Dave the approval he had sought for 30 years. For Johnny to swallow his pride and make that call, you knew Dave was one of the Mount Rushmore picks. If there was ever a guest who treated The Tonight Show like a treehouse, it was Burt Reynolds. Burt appeared a staggering 61 times, making him arguably the most frequent guest in the show's history. This wasn't business, it was friendship. Burt and Johnny were real-life friends. They played tennis together. They chased women together. And on air, they were two guys trying to make each other laugh so hard that the broadcast would go to commercial early. Their chemistry was physical. There is a famous clip, included in the featured guest series, where Burt sprayed whipped cream down Johnny's pants. Another time, they got into a tickling fight. Carson, the controlled interviewer, would turn into a 12-year-old boy when Burt was on the couch. Burt was the guy Johnny could gossip with about the pretty actresses in the green room without the microphone picking it up. He was the brother Johnny never had. Joan Rivers is the great tragedy of the Carson era, yet her inclusion on the loved list is undeniable because the betrayal hurt so much. In the mid-1960s, Joan was a struggling comic. Her first appearance was terrifying. She later wrote about clutching her hands in her lap, focusing only on Johnny's warm, laughing face. Johnny didn't just like Joan, he elevated her. He made her the permanent guest host, a role no woman had held. She was his protégée. They had an empathy that required no words. But in 1986, when Fox offered her a competing show, she took it without telling Johnny. He never spoke to her again. The silence lasted 30 years, until her death. However, the fact that Carson felt so betrayed is the ultimate proof of love. You cannot fall out like that with someone you didn't deeply care for. In the pantheon of Carson's heart, Joan occupies the room that is locked and never spoken of because it hurts too much. October 14, 1981. The date is burned into the memory of comedy fans. Robin Williams, already buzzing from Mork and Mindy, exploded onto the stage. He was wearing a bright yellow sweater. He shook Johnny's hand, and then the hand dissolved. For the next 8 minutes, Johnny Carson, the man who controlled the universe, lost control. Williams ricocheted from a Russian immigrant to a surreal interpretation of the Bible to talking about his wrists. He didn't pause for breath. The audience was screaming. And Carson? Carson was crying. He was leaning back in his chair, helpless, his shoulders shaking. "You know," Johnny said, wiping his eyes, "we have a show to do, but if you want to just keep going." That quote sums it up. Johnny loved guests who worked hard, but Robin was a force of nature. He made Johnny feel like a spectator again, which, after 20 years on the air, was the greatest gift anyone could give him. Johnny Carson once admitted he was jealous of Dean Martin. Dean didn't try. He stood on stage with a scotch in his hand, sang a little, mumbled a little, and was the coolest man alive. Carson, who agonized over every monologue joke, envied that effortless cool. Dean Martin only appeared a handful of times, but when he did, it was magic. In the late 80s and early 90s, Dean was fading due to health issues. However, on Carson, the old sparkle returned. Johnny treated Dean with a reverence he rarely showed. He would set up jokes and let Dean knock them down with a lazy wave. Their friendship was cemented in alcohol and mutual respect. They were the two kings of the Rat Pack era, though Johnny was more of an honorary member. When Dean guest hosted, Johnny would watch from home. Carson loved Dean because Dean represented the lifestyle Johnny wanted, rich, relaxed, and constantly holding a cocktail. Don Rickles did the impossible, he insulted the king and got away with it. "You schmuck," Rickles would yell as he walked on stage. "You're doing great for a guy who can't act." Johnny loved Rickles because he was the only person in the world who was not afraid of him. Everyone else tiptoed around the host. Rickles ran him over. He would call Ed McMahon a fat idiot and tell Doc Severinsen to shut up and play the clarinet. The chaos freed Johnny. The best moments were when Rickles would pull out his list. He would pretend to read a review of Johnny's performance that night. "It says here you have the personality of a glazed donut," Rickles would say. Carson's face would turn red not from anger, but from trying to suppress a giggle. Don Rickles was the only guest who appeared over 100 times simply because he made Johnny Carson lose his composure. You might be expecting a comedian for the top spot. But to understand Johnny Carson, you have to understand his isolation. He was uncomfortable with sincerity. He couldn't hug another celebrity without feeling phony. But put him next to Joan Embery, who brought a baby elephant, or Jim Fowler, who brought a deadly snake. Johnny became a little boy. His genuine, unadulterated joy peaked when the studio was full of wild animals. Fowler was a master of scaring Carson. He would bring out a lion or a cheetah, and Johnny would jump on the chair not as a bit, but out of real fear and excitement. When a monkey climbed on Johnny's head, he didn't try to look cool. He giggled. He asked real questions. These guests won the popularity poll of Carson's heart because they offered him the one thing he craved most, a break from being Johnny Carson. He didn't have to be witty. He just had to react. In a 30-year career of talking, his favorite guests were often the ones who couldn't talk back. They were authentic, unpredictable, and didn't want an autograph. Johnny Carson walked away from the show in 1992 and never looked back. He refused to be a guest on the shows that replaced him. He knew that the magic was in the chair, not in the man. But you can bet that on quiet nights in Malibu, Johnny was watching the tapes. He was watching the manic energy of Robin Williams, the insults of Don Rickles, the easy charm of Burt Reynolds, and the animals that made him smile. They weren't just guests, they were the only people, human or animal, who made the loneliest job in the world feel like a party. And that is why he loved them most.